Hello and welcome to the Broken Warriors Guide to Books. Today I'm going to talk to you a bit about Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell, which is one of my favourite novels and one I've reread very many times. It's a Victorian novel set in an English country village, and it tells the story of Molly Gibson, a girl in her late teens, and her father and their family, and particularly the impact of her father's second marriage on Molly and on the lives of everyone around her. It is, in some ways, fits the stereotype of a Victorian novel of being very long and slow, and that's true, but it completely works, and that slowness gives you an incredible richness of detail, an incredibly well-drawn character portraits. If you feel like you know the characters in this novel, even quite minor characters, incredibly well. And what Gaskell does really beautifully is catching the subtleties of interactions between people and relationships between people, and the complexities that can exist even in really loving, positive relationships and friendships, and the misunderstandings that arise. So Molly Gibson, as I said, is the main character, who I really like. In some ways, she's the kind of very morally good, upright Victorian heroine who is devoted to her family and in some ways kind of devoted to the stereotypically feminine activities of caring. But while she's good, she's never insipid. Her goodness is driven by passion and passionate love, and she deeply cares for her father and her stepsister, and the Hamley family, who she comes to know very greatly. And she's willing to take risks for the people that she loves, and do things which are perhaps at least look against conventional morality, and she's very brave and caring in that. She's almost how Jane Eyre would have been if Jane Eyre had a loving father, I think. And she also has a curiosity, and she cares about the natural world and science, despite the men around her father at least, not expecting her to really care. She will go out and learn, as well as having a passion for poetry and Byron and that side of things. Her counterpoint, I suppose, is her stepsister, Cynthia Kirkpatrick, who is very beautiful and very charming and has lots of winning ways, and everyone falls in love with her, but doesn't have the same moral core, and as a result doesn't have the same certainty in herself, or the same almost ability to achieve happiness. And having the contrast between those two, and seeing not just the outer interactions, but their decision making and their different faces, is really powerful. The character of Kirkpatrick, Hyacinth Clare, who then becomes Kirkpatrick and then becomes Mrs. Gibson, is also a really interestingly drawn character, and I think is one of those examples of, with the realism in this book, of the harm being done to others is not kind of deliberate evil. It's kind of comes from quite a subtle selfishness that Mrs. Gibson typifies, and seeing her almost create quite these elaborate reasons for things to go her own way, and ways of presenting herself when she's very insistent that she's not selfish and she's very put upon, and you get the sense that she does believe that, and this amazing self-deception Gaskell creates beautifully. And there's the interactions between her and Molly, where you're, as a reader, completely on Molly's side and seeing that frustration coming there. And also the other way that kind of harm and suffering comes about in this novel is misunderstanding, particularly in the familial relationship between two of the other characters within the Hamley family, the squire and his older son, Roger. And Gaskell writes with a great degree of empathy for her characters. She's witty and she exposes their flaws, but you're never invited to laugh in a cruel way. There's always a real humanity to her writing, which I absolutely love. And that comes across, as I said, in a slightly tragic relationship. And also in the depiction of grief in this novel is so well done that you absolutely do care for these characters and you feel their tragedy. And it's not overwrought or overdone, and no one's kind of screaming and flinging themselves off cliff tops, but you feel that grief and the impact that has and the loss, and that's really important and quite an interesting thing to see in writing of this, how families go on and what happens to families after grief and tragedy. So on the lighter side, there is an element of romance in this book. It's partly about these two sisters and who's going to fall in love with them and who they're going to marry, and that element of it is quite enjoyable of seeing Woolly's feelings even when she's not aware of them, and seeing that play out. And it's quite in some ways quite reminiscent of Mansfield Park. So if that's a novel that you enjoy, then I think this is Wives and Daughters is very much something to read next. Although my main caveat about that, and my major warning about this book, is that Gaskell died while writing it. She died probably about 2 chapters from the end. So you get to the point where some of the loose ends are tied up, and you can see where the happy ending is going, but you don't get it because she died. So I didn't know that the first time I read this book, and it broke my heart. So that just to warn you, the remedy for that is to go and watch the 1990s BBC adaptation, and they're very well written and satisfying ending, and that adaptation is actually, I think, very well done and has an extremely good cast, so it's worth watching anyway. But you kind of need it just for the satisfaction of having the ending that you've spent 500 pages working towards. So yeah, that is a major caveat. This novel is very is also to some extent a social commentary of this time, and some of, if you're interested in Victorian social history and the themes of kind of the shift towards different kinds of knowledge being valued in terms of science, and there's some quite subtle stuff about the class system and the aristocracy and old landowners and their different roles and the interactions, then it's very interesting. But if you don't care about that and you don't have any previous knowledge of it, that's also fine, and you can. It's not going to affect your enjoyment of the novel, which does, as I said, very much come from these characters, both the really well drawn main characters and the really emotional reactions between them, but also the kind of side characters who bring with them their own joys. Lady Harriet is one I particularly love, for her wit, and also she's someone who learns throughout the novel and changes her behaviour, and her irreverency I quite enjoy. So yeah, I'd say I'm someone who does love Victorian novels and will plough through Dickens and Wilkie Collins, but I think this is one that a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily pick up those novels would think of reading. It's kind of to some extent an unsung classic, and definitely it's one of where if you read all of Jane Austen and love her and want to know what to read next, then Wives and Daughters is a really good place to start with Gaskell. So yeah, overall I love her writing, the wittiness, the characters, the plot, that real sense of humanity and empathy. So yeah, that's why Wives and Daughters is one of my favourite novels. So yes, go out and read it if you get the chance. So yeah, thank you very much for watching.